All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break and certainly a good morning of presentations. We're going to get rolling here because we have another excellent presentation on the way. We're very fortunate today to be joined as well by Kweli Rashied-Henry out of Durham County. And Kweli is the Racial Equity Officer for Durham County government. In this role, she leads and coordinates efforts to advance racial equity across the jurisdiction by integrating equity principles into operations, procedures, policies, programs, projects, and services. The county's racial equity goals are accomplished in part through the application of best practices, training, and staff development, and tracking and measurement of outcomes. So she does a lot of great work in Durham, and she's also working on her DRPH degree as well. So she stays busy. And Kweli, we're so honored to have you here with us to talk about advancing racial equity in local government. So without further ado, I'll transfer it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. And I appreciate you all joining me for the spring conference and this session on planting seeds of transformation, advancing racial equity in local government. And I really want to start off by thanking Rod Jenkins and Kim Dittman for all of the support in bringing me here to this session today and acknowledging the speakers that have come before me. I'm really excited to share a little bit about our journey at Durham County government with you. So I became the inaugural racial equity officer a year ago during a time of tremendous change, right? And rapid change and lots of challenges. The country was facing the reality of the pandemic. And in late May, Brother George Floyd was killed unjustly by police officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. And in Durham County, we were having our own sort of local response to these challenges. And so I step and enter into this environment that was really bereft with rapid change that requires us to think and act quickly, yet be very, very thoughtful and have thoughtful consideration of the implications of the responses to these challenges. Because we know that traditionally communities of color and low-income communities have borne the brunt of poor decisions, inadequate decisions, and sometimes no decisions at all, right, that are based on tremendous need. And so with this focus on racial inequities and these challenges due to racism and discrimination, institutional and structural racism in our society, we focus on these intersecting examples of oppression. And how do we position ourselves to address these challenges as a country? And how do we become champions of anti-racism so that we can truly advance racial equity? So this is really a story about our journey that we're taking to educate ourselves about what it takes to do this work and how we're working to immediately apply what we learn. And we're not always getting it right. We're not going to get it right, but we do have this sense of urgency. And I think that that is a requirement because of the importance of these issues and the seriousness of these issues in many respects. So with our time here today, I am going to describe the government's process of creating the racial equity baseline and benchmarks for eliminating racial inequities across service areas. I am going to say a little bit about the benefits and challenges of applying racial equity tools towards decision-making in county government. And I'm really going to use this analogy of planting in a garden, fertilizing the soil, prepping the gardener, and protecting your seedlings to kind of demonstrate what our journey has really consisted of and how we're moving ahead to ensure that we really can see the outcomes that we're intending for the work that we have set out for ourselves. And so as I discuss this, these three sections are really going to help me pinpoint what it takes to normalize conversations on race and racism. Establishing the baseline, prepping the gardener is really going to be about the leadership commitment and how the racial equity champions at the county are helping to see change. And the last section here is really about ensuring that we have long-term commitment to equity to ensure that that is understood and how we amass the resources that are needed to build our capacity and infrastructure so that the work is sustainable. All right. So in terms of fertilizing the soil, I think it's important for us to just be mindful of our history, right? And to ensure that we think about and acknowledge that history and get comfortable with the ugliness of that history in some respects. And so we start out by acknowledging that we live on stolen land in Durham. I'm here in Durham County. I've been living here for 9 years now and never really knew and understood the indigenous communities that occupied this land before European settlers got here, right? So I know now that the tribes of the Occaneechi, the Saponi, the Eno inhabited this land hundreds of years ago. And then also acknowledging how we as a country have benefited from the Middle Passage, which allowed chattel slavery to persist across these lands for 240 years. And after a brief period of Reconstruction, we saw the terrors of Jim Crow take the lives of many of our ancestors and rob us of our livelihood and rob us of the economic advancements and the wealth accumulation that had been expected, prior to the emancipation of African slaves. And yet and still, we're faced with explosive growth today of Black and Brown communities in North Carolina over the past 2 decades. And here in North Carolina in particular, we've seen our Latinx population grow 7-fold. And we know that the demographic shifts that we're experiencing give new meaning for our work. And it also serves as an imperative of sorts for equity. So in many ways, government has explicitly been driving many of the inequitable policies that have led to present day disparities that we see across life outcomes, right? So in addition to health, think of the social determinants, housing, criminal legal system, child welfare, educational, even civic engagement, right? And the voter restriction laws that we're seeing. And in some ways, we see these institutional racist practices occur and government remain complicit in some of these actions. But if we are about advancing racial equity in government, we have to hold a mirror up and acknowledge, the ugliness and the harm and be prepared to face these challenges and the challenges to come in dealing with the legacy of oppression and how to respond equitably to right wrongs that happen present day and continue to position ourselves for the impending change that's happening right before our eyes. So when we think about racism, and I share this, and I know you know this, but I share this to just ensure that we have common language here. We know that most aspects of our society are racialized, and we know that race is a social construct. There's nothing innately or biologically inferior about people of color, but we live in a racialized society, and racism is that system that structures opportunity and assigns value based on how someone looks. And this definition comes to us from Dr. Kamar Jones, who's the past president of APHA, and I think it's very befitting for us to just think about how racism operates and always ask that question, sort of how is racism operating here? The other thing that Dr. Jones talked about, in addition to her own allegory of the gardener's tale and how to describe the different levels of racism, she talks about these various levels, and what we tend to focus on in the work that we're doing within is think racism, but it's important to note the other levels of racism, right? And we focus on the structural piece because that's where we know we have more control of the outcomes. So the structural piece has to do with the systems of racial bias across institutions and across society that cause the cumulative and compounding effects that advantage white people of color. And when we think about what happens within institutions and organizations, so think schools, government agencies, businesses, when there is an adoption or maintenance of a policy that produces inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people, we see that and define that as institutional racism. And then the individual racism deals with the prejudgment or bias or discrimination by an individual based on their race. And we focus less here, although it involves changing hearts and minds. And we can get to some of that, but we can't always convince people with our data, or we can't take the moral high ground, or we can't convince people that this is the superior growth model to address inequities. We just sort of let people grapple with their own biases and stereotypes and work through them as they're faced with policy and practice change in their workforce, for example. And then there's also the interpersonal racism, which is important because this is the way in which we think about how oppression is internalized that results in individuals or groups believing things about themselves that have been taught, stereotypes that have been, relayed, and can be very, very harmful to the psyche, if you will. So I mentioned that we focus on the structural piece of all of the forms of racism. Structural racism has the greatest influence across our lives. It's embedded in these societal policies and practices that adversely affect non-dominant groups in society at every level. And this is a form of racism that dictates to people the type of neighborhoods you can live in, or the type of schools that are available in your community, or the libraries that are available in your community, or to an extent, the availability of fresh food or health promoting activities, the green space. And residential segregation, we know, has played a key role in the placement of alcohol and tobacco outlets, for example, or refineries or toxic landfills. So the structural piece cuts across various systems, and it's important for us to think structurally so that we can begin to identify what are the entry points for us, what are the on-ramps for us to really think about how we can address inequities across the board. So we talked a lot about racism, but what is racial equity? And so here we use the example from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which says that racial equity is when racial identity cannot be used to predict individual or group life outcomes. So outcomes in those systems that we talked about, and outcomes for all groups are improved. So it's a way for us to really think about how we can recognize equity when we see it, and it hasn't been something that we have actually realized in our country yet. But if we think about, outcomes being improved for everyone and outcomes not being predicted by a person's race, that really gives us sort of a North Star to work from and something to work towards achieving. So I just want to take a step back and start sharing with you the story of Durham County's experience in this space. And I was so pleased to catch the tail end of Mark's presentation talking about the importance of stories. And so there's always a backstory, right? Like Durham County just didn't hop up one year and say, hey, we need a racial equity officer. This took a lot of work behind the scenes to position its importance within the county, and the health department led the way, right? So through the county health department, Durham County began to provide racial equity trainings to staff, and not just staff, but partners, volunteers, others in the community, just recognizing the importance of broadening the discussion and awareness on what it would take to achieve racial equity. And these trainings happen from the Racial Equity Institute. The purpose of these trainings was really to normalize the conversations on racial equity and to provide some foundational knowledge, and so that others could understand the impact, the racial equity impact among communities of color here in Durham. And there were 3 core trainings that REI provided, and we were able to take advantage of the groundwater presentation and the phase 1 training that is hosted by REI. And we had a lot of success with this. So over a 4-year period, thousands of individuals were trained in racial equity, and our trainings were joined by representatives from a number of different sectors. So here on this chart, you see who actually participated in the training opportunities that we provided. And this is just one snapshot of data from 2018 to 2019. We had over 1,000 folks participate in our groundwater trainings. And this just gives you an idea of who was there. The majority of people were there who participated were from businesses, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations. A quarter of the folks who participated were from educational institutions, including the school systems and colleges and universities. About 12% of the folks were actual government employees from different departments across the county and within the city of Durham as well. So not just the Durham County There were other municipalities and jurisdictions who participated, and a few of the folks who participated were attending on their own, just out of their own sense of personal advocacy, and we had some smaller representation from the media. So I said some about the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and I think what happened from starting those conversations, those earlier discussions on what is racial equity, what is the importance of thinking about our history and how we got here, and how these inequities show up across different systems, we began to get that question, well, what do we do about it, right? So in as much as folks take this information back and share it with those in their own networks, thinking about how this maybe had a role in local government and the day-to-day work that was happening here, that was a question that I think many of our leaders began to be faced with. And we were fortunate enough to join the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a national network of member jurisdictions across the country. There are about over 300 jurisdictions that participate, and they have this guiding framework that really helps us to think about what it will take to do racial equity work. So we're normalizing the conversations on race, and I mentioned a little bit of that in terms of training, operationalizing new policies and practices, and organizational culture. So the culture shift is a huge piece of just doing and thinking about work differently, and then organizing across sector and with community to achieve racial equity. So racial equity work cannot happen without engaging the folks who are directly impacted by the inequities that we seek to eliminate. And so this is just a little bit more about that normalizing piece. So what happens is there's pre-work that happens, and thinking about how to elevate racial equity into the individual or group consciousness requires some sense of getting to the heart and the mind of what are the early experiences that people have related to race and racism. So who were your early teachers? When did you notice a difference in neighborhood? When did racial awareness become a thing? And Dr. Jones talks about in her research how people of color often think about their race every day. But, white folks, people who are not in that category, in the BIPOC category, that's just not a thing, right? And so I think it's important for us to just have that starting point where we're elevating race and racism into our consciousness. And then the trainings and presentations follow through. And that's when we can share with diverse voices talking about their experiences. This is not just work for people of color alone. And these kind of dinner conversations that we hope to see more of can prompt new ways of thinking, new ways of being, and new ways to challenge our institutions to consider the kinds of changes that we need to be to ultimately address the inequities that we want to eliminate. And then the connections and the influence, right? Using those things to ultimately build up the social capital so that we have this initiative well-resourced within our institutions. The other thing that we're really focused on is understanding our baseline. So we talked about inequity. We know we're looking for gaps sort of by race and ethnicity across different outcomes, but what does our own data say? And what do we look like in terms of the representation of people of color in various positions across our own institution? Are we inclusive? So that's basically related to the quality of the relationships and the willingness of folks to be their own authentic selves in this quest to really push and advance racial equity. And then thinking about, who our stakeholders are, right? And understanding how we connect with different stakeholders and relate to them to better understand the history within the departments that we're trying to bring along in this process, and building community relationships, oftentimes which require bridges to kind of past harms and think about the racial trauma that has persisted over time. So one of the things that we really started with was this whole notion of employee engagement, just understanding what our employees thought about racial equity and inequity, and what was their ultimate vision for us to be doing this work, and how did they see themselves in helping us to be accountable to the charge that we laid out So I'll share in a moment, what some of the results were from the earlier survey that we did last year. But this is an index that gives you a sense of what our inequities look like across the state, right? So what's nice is that we're part of a movement. And within that movement, there are multiple organizations that have their eye on supporting groups that are really taking on this charge of advancing racial equity. And they're thinking about, the data and providing tools and resources to ensure that we could, provide data that is easily translatable to people who are passionate about this issue and want to do something about the issue. So ultimately, when we look at North Carolina ranks 28 out of 50 on the racial equity index at the state level. And the racial equity index value is based on an inclusion score and a prosperity score. So what's an inclusion score and what's in a prosperity score? So the measures here help us determine how a given geography is compared with its peers in terms of the racial gaps that exist across these 9 common indicators in the index. And the inclusion score provides a comparative overview of racial equity in the community, considering the 6 racial ethnic groups: white, Black, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, or mixed. And the minimum possible value is 1 and the highest is 100. So this is the inclusion score here on the right. And the inclusion score reflects only the relative magnitude of racial gaps across the indicators, not necessarily how the community is doing overall. That's kind of measured by the prosperity. But you see these domains here, right? Economic vitality. So that's looking at the median wage, unemployment, and poverty. Readiness has to do with educational attainment, disconnected youth, and school poverty. And the connectedness has to do with air pollution, commute time, and rent burden. So this gives you a sense of where we fall within Durham in terms of our inclusion score. It helps us to note where we have more work to do. And also you see here our prosperity score, which tells us how we're doing in relation to other geography, our other counties, our peer counties. So this is an important backdrop, and this comes from the National Equity Atlas from Policy Link, but it's a really important backdrop to understanding our baseline, right? And the other part to this is, who are we? What do we look like as an employee base? And so the interesting thing about Durham County is that we are majority Black or African American. So here you see data, I think this is 2019 data, 56% of our employees, almost 2,000 employees, are Black, 37% are white. We have 4% Hispanic or Latinx, 1% Asian, and less than 1% Native American Pacific Islander. I think I'm interpreting that correctly. Yes, and then this is our gender chart. So majority of employees at Durham County are female, and 40% are male. So we did this survey back in July of 2020. It was open to all employees, and we got over 1,300 responses, which is really good for the number of employees that we have in total. And staff were able to respond anonymously to the survey. And with that really good response rate that we had, we learned a lot about where we needed to lean in and how folks were thinking about our journey to advance racial equity in government. And so what you see here on this slide is in response to a question related to setting up the infrastructure and being able to actually operationalize racial equity. And so when we ask the question, does your department have the necessary resources to advance racial equity? Meaning, do you have a racial equity team? Is there a racial equity action plan? Is there a visible way that you are addressing racial equity? 40% of our employees responded. And when we asked the question about, well, are you applying the racial equity tool? Do you have an action plan or work group? Only 4 to 5% responded. So it was interesting here to see when we asked the question, do you have the resource? But sources, but then gave the specific example of the resources that we were referring to, we had even less response, very little response there. And so to me, this is the pulse point. This is where we can step in and really make some changes, but not just diving in, ensuring that we're also providing a way for folks to understand the foundational pieces of the work we're doing, and also what is that broader vision and how does it fit into the national momentum that we're experiencing now to really push for racial equity. And the other way that we're starting to see this push in the national momentum build is departments, counties, governments are health departments, county governments across the country are declaring racism as a public health crisis. So many of you may know that this trend sort of started with Wisconsin, where they declared racism as a public health crisis across the state. And thinking about the 11 sort of declarations that have happened in North Carolina, the APHA's kind of keeping track of this, as well as the National Association of County Officials, and others very likely are tracking, where are we seeing these declarations happen, and how are we experiencing any movement on what these declarations are really comprised of. So in June of last year, Durham County presented its resolution, and it was really brought to the county from the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People. And it outlined many of the health disparities and inequities that you have become familiar with in terms of the higher incidence of infant mortality, the prevalence of diabetes, the lower life expectancy of African Americans, the impact of mental health and depression and anxiety as a consequence of many of these health conditions. And then the resolution goes on to present these 8 sort of call to action statements. And they really serve as a guidepost to operationalize this work from the government and community partnership perspective. So it reads here, we want to see that there is an assertion that racism is a public health crisis affecting our community, work in progress as an equity and justice-oriented organization with the board and its staff leadership continuing to identify specific activities to further enhance diversity and to ensure anti-racism principles across the board, leadership, staffing, and contracting persist. We want to see that evidence of that. Promote equity through all policies approved by the board and enhance educational efforts aimed at understanding, addressing, and dismantling racism and how it affects the delivery of human and social services and economic development. Support community efforts to amplify issues of racism and engage actively and authentically with communities of color wherever they live. And here are the rest of them. To always promote and support policies that prioritize the health of all people, especially people of color, by mitigating exposure to adverse childhood life experiences. So you see that call out to community trauma. Ensure ongoing anti-racism, racial equity training with the goal of reaching all members of the Board of County Commissioners, county leadership, and staff. Encourage current racial equity training among all community partners, grantees, vendors, and contractors. And the last one here, identify clear goals and objectives, including periodic reports to the board, and to assess progress and capitalize on opportunities to further advance racial equity. So, to me, this is it. This is the action plan, right? Many of these statements are so well aligned with our action plan, and we're working with the Durham Committee now and other partners to learn about the community's commitment to these action statements as well. But this is a comprehensive overview of the direction that we need to be pursuing to ensure that we really tap into how to address racial equity and get to solutions. So that was all about the soil, right? Fertilizing the soil, making sure that we have some really fertile ground here. And any gardeners out there know that soil prep is critical to ensuring good crops. So this was the foundational steps that we're taking to really plant these seeds for transformational change. Is necessary. It takes a lot of work, and we're not done. right? But we also know that the role of the gardener, the leaders who are ushering in the change, requires some examination and some specific preparation as well. So one person cannot do this alone. If that were the case, I don't think I'd be in my position if I was charged with just doing everything. It's important to establish champions and sponsors, people who can support this work in their own respective roles, and think about the leadership opportunities for those leaders as well, those individuals as well. So we're thinking here about the influence of our change makers and who's ultimately has the authority, explicit or non-explicit, to pursue the changes that are desired to reach these long-standing and long-term actions. We know that communities are just in real pain, and the outcomes that we're trying to improve are causing harm. So how we keep our eye on our goals and consider the supports that are required, especially for the people who are championing the change, is just extremely, extremely important. So with all of the work that we've done to lay the groundwork to ensure that we're really moving in the direction that we need to be moving, our core team has come up with this vision statement. Our vision for Durham is to be a resilient community where all residents can live, grow, thrive, and achieve optimal outcomes on their own term during their life course. And what we know it's going to take for us is to really think about shifting our culture, embracing our commitment, and serving our community. And just to go back to some of the earlier statements I made about our history and the importance of acknowledging that history, it's just a reminder again of why this work is so important. So when you think about government's role in perpetuating a lot of these inequities across systems, we know therefore that it's government's responsibility to address the structural and institutional racism, the root causes of the inequities, racial inequities that we see. So in terms of who's helping, who's participating in this, you see here folks who joined the initial GARE team and provided support for the North Carolina learning community that was organized by GARE in 2019, which really represented an opportunity to learn how to apply that GARE framework of normalizing, operationalize, organize, visualize to advance racial equity. And here are the original members of our core team. We've since done a refresh, and we really aim to ensure that we have representation from all 27 departments from across the county, which we now have. And we're building on that foundational awareness to ensure that all of us have the experience and are building up our muscle to operationalize racial equity. So we're taking the work back. We're not just sitting on it. We're not just pursuing it for the betterment of a county plan. We're actually taking the work back. And so when we think about what it is that we're all arriving at, sort of these assumptions that we want to make sure that people understand and can really build up a narrative that we agree upon, we think about this notion of intersectionality and using the racial equity lens to learn how to unpack the identities that we all bring and think about the overlapping systems of oppression as leverage points to address these problems that we have in society, right? So the main focus of the racial equity lens is to maintain and deepen our understanding of these concepts that we touched some on already. So racial equity is about that struggle for freedom among the Black, Indigenous, people of color community due to the oppression stemming from our history in this country of colonialism, chattel slavery, white supremacy, and think about the enduring legacy of oppression and white supremacy that's embedded into our systems and infrastructure. Also our norms, our social and cultural norms, our relationships, and how those inequities have resulted in inequitable outcomes for communities of color across systems. And then this was what I was mentioning, that, there is a responsibility of us to think about the intersectional roles that we all bring and how we can unpack them and use our focus on racial equity, using that lens to unpack these identities and how these systems are overlapping with one another. Think about power and privilege, who holds it, how it manifests, how it can be redistributed in conversations, actions, program policy, institutions, and structures across society. And then whiteness as a construct that must be unpacked primarily by white people so that there is a comprehensive approach to racial equity whereby the consequences of inequities are recognized and attempts are made to rectify any injustices. Um, and here's what you see as a result of all of that, sort of the agreement on the common language and the narratives and assumptions. So we can all agree that this is what we need to know and sort of understand if we're going to be doing this work together, that we need to ensure that we're creating leadership opportunities for people so that I'm not always the person out front speaking, that we have opportunities for others to take on a personal interest or professional interest that they have to really address a data issue that they've identified, to provide a storytelling opportunity, to engage the community in a way in which the community has expressed it would like to be engaged. And so all of these agreements lead us to just deepening our ability to operationalize racial equity and helps us to ensure that we're building on the common language that we have, we're providing a common narrative or narrative frame, and that we are very clear about the assumptions that we're working from. So this brings me to my last little segment here. And so we want to make sure that we spend some time flexing our equity muscles so that we have a really solid backbone and a basis for how we organize around racial equity. And so going back to that garden analogy, like when you start fertilizing the soil and the gardener is on board and it's very clear about what the charge is and how we're going to attack, you know, this garden and see it, ensure that it flourishes. Once you start to see the budding growth happen, then you've got to do what you need to do to protect your seedlings, whether that's, you know, the water or the sunshine or protecting it from the elements, you know, all of the above. And thinking about, you know, how are we going to know when we've reached success, right? So that's really what I want to lay out for you, that even though we've not sort of experienced the full bounty of our garden yet, we're starting to see some seedlings maybe crop up in some areas. But in order for us to really think about how we will achieve actionable results and how will we know that we actually arrived at an actionable result, we've got to project that out, right? And we've got to start thinking about our evaluation process from the very beginning. And so we're giving that some thought, and actually we're excited that we're able to use this momentum to begin applying racial equity tools. So GARE has provided an example, and there are lots of great examples out there. I know North Carolina, through the Division of Public Health, has also come up with the Health Impact Tool, a Health Equity Impact Tool, which provides the same level of assessment that's needed to basically follow these steps, if you will. And so in following the steps, you want to make sure that you're establishing and maintaining community trust and that you're acknowledging and addressing historical harm. So a lot of that has to do with knowing and learning your history and connecting with community leaders, traditional or non-traditional, to kind of understand what the dynamics are in the community and how might inequities really play out for folks that you're trying to see improvements in those communities and among those groups. And if you're proactively seeking to eliminating racial inequities and advance racial equity, you've got to know what that data is. What does it look like? Have clear goals and objectives and measurable outcomes, engaging the community in this decision-making process. And what you see highlighted here in green is really where the rubber hits the road, meets the road. You want to be able to identify who's burdened, who's benefiting from a given decision, and examine the potential for unintended consequences of a decision prior to even making that decision, right? And then thinking about those strategies in the beginning so that you can mitigate any unintended negative consequences. The organizing across multiple sectors, we tend to see that in any sort of community-facing initiative where we're seeking to improve outcomes and racial inequities follow suit, and then developing a mechanism for successful implementation and evaluation of impact. So this next slide here is very dense, but I did want to share it because it is another commonly accepted framework of community engagement, where we're describing engagement as a continuum and really thinking about what it takes to build or rebuild the public trust, right? So when we think about the kinds of partnerships and collaborations that we're seeking and moving from the left side of the continuum of just having, one-way communication or exchange, dialogue about something, to actually involving residents in a process that ensures that their concerns are heard or understood and considered by staff, to actually collaborating with residents so that we can identify those problems together, develop alternative solutions together, and implement them together. And towards the right side of the continuum, where shared decision-making takes on more of an empowerment function, you're placing the final decision-making authority or problem-solving responsibility in the hands of residents. So this is a commonly used framework to kind of describe community engagement as a continuum. And what's here on this next slide demonstrates what Durham County has kind of said. So when we have polled residents in our resident satisfaction survey, recently the Office on Youth did an entire sort of listening tour. We have a whole process right now happening called Engage Durham, which is about the comprehensive plan. There's a parallel process that is looking at the transit plan. So all of these sort of planning activities, regular functions of government, provide opportunities for input from community, and they tell us how they want to be engaged. So this is what we've seen. Folks do want to have those opportunities to share in the decision making. They like it when they can have one-on-one engagement directly with staff. Also, thinking about community ambassadors, people who are most familiar with what is happening in a community and using that expertise to help us determine, translate what the needs are and what the potential solutions might be. We heard about the importance of storytelling and using qualitative story mapping, qualitative methods like journey mapping, mind mapping, other ways to kind of showcase and demonstrate what that community input. Photo voice is another example. Cultural events. So folks have told us that they'd like to see more cultural events. And what you see in the middle represents ways in which we can position ourselves to establish a structure to get to the consistency, the level of consistency that we'd like to see across all departments. So there may be funding available for community members. The data reporting can be visible and transparent, and the communications can be done differently so that we're not relying on traditional modes of communication, but tapping into that Instagram, for example. And then the last thing not the last thing, but one of the last things that I want to highlight here are some of the pilot projects that we're focused on, right? So we're focusing on workforce equity, contracting and procurement, and criminal justice. And these are examples of our ability, how we're demonstrating the use of the racial equity tool and where we're digging in. So we're looking at things like, what are our hiring and recruitment practices? Are they equitable? Think back to what I showed you before about how Durham County has a high majority Black African-American employee base, but what about our Hispanic Latinx community members that, represent 14% of our population in Durham? Are they represented in county government? And is there an opportunity to think about recruitment differently, thinking across the different pay bands that we have within government? Are we seeing inequities there? Thinking about contracting and procurement, we do have a robust MWBE program, Minority Women Business Enterprise Program. We've done a disparity study back in 2015, but we're learning that there are some things that we can think about differently regarding our contracting and procurement practices, and ensuring that there's some standard ways and methods of assessing this, looking at our data across all departments. And then in terms of criminal justice, so this came about, again, thinking back about the tenor of the country last summer and how our focus was on criminal justice. But, we know that has not been the starting point. Like, our focus and attention on criminal justice did not just start with George Floyd's murder. But this has been something that we've had our eye on the ball, just thinking about, 2 million Black and Brown people incarcerated currently, and how that could be traced back to the war on drugs and mandatory minimum sentencing and all of the things that we're hearing a lot about in the news that are coming up for review, if you will, and thinking about the reform conversation and how we want to be sure that we're really using our influence and leveraging the interest that we have in advancing racial equity to support ongoing efforts that are focused on the same. So there are lots of stakeholders involved in this aspect of our criminal justice focus, and to see where that goes, the direction that that's taking us. So components that relate to our ability to really operate, work and organize ourselves around racial equity has to do with the infrastructure development and the support that we know we need. So go back to what I said about, one person alone not sort of carrying this heavy load on her own, but we know that data can help us tell the story, and there's some neat examples out there of racial equity indices that are providing a lot of the data on the different systems that are giving us a profile, if you will. What is our equity profile of Durham County, and how that can result in sort of a transparency portal. And we have an opportunity within this system to embed and integrate our managing for results model, which is a very similar function that the county has positioned well in support of its strategic plan. And we're part of a GIS mapping pilot to begin to look at our data using the mapping function, similar to what you see here on the screen. So we know we have more to do, and we'll definitely have more to come related to the infrastructure support that we get and that we'll continue to need as we move forward. But, by and large, our commitment to operationalizing racial equity is really going to ensure that we're increasing the equity skills and competencies. We're focused on eliminating disparities in the systems where we know we can make some immediate policy and practice change, and push for long-term and improve the community conditions. Like that is the end goal. It's not perfunctory work. It requires a lot of emotional intelligence, a lot of courageous and crucial conversations. And it's not going to just be about a technical fix, right? It requires a lot of adaptive thought, flexible enough to think differently and to act differently. But we know we need to know what success looks like, and to start to paint a picture success will look like. And so what you see here in my Venn diagram has to do with our future Office on Racial Equity, technical assistance and consultative support to different departments, and our departments serve they provide, including our Department of Health, thinking about how racial equity is being advanced in particular decisions that are being now. All of that will require community and buy-in, hopefully make the impact that we want to see in community. So for my final slide here, I just want to recap and reiterate, what it takes for us to really build and to really think about seeding this change, this transformational change that we are committed to within the county, starting off with the trainings, continuing with the trainings, and not just training for ourselves, but also thinking about volunteers and community partners. How GARE has been a really good resource for us to tap into the membership and to have connections with other jurisdictions that are doing similar work. Having a resource in me, a full-time person dedicated to this work, to ensuring that, folks can connect with me as they want to bounce off ideas or are thinking about applying tools in their respective departments, making sure that we understand our baseline. So we'll repeat that employee survey next year. We'll do it every 2 years. And in addition to that, we had some visioning sessions where we spoke with staff directly as well, and some small sessions, small group sessions. We'll continue that. And then deploy the racial equity tools. So going back to the decision-making tools, and to ensure that for any sort of we have standardized way to kind of assess whether or not we are considering decisions from the equity lens or the equity frame. And then I think we just need more examples of counties making visible their commitment to addressing racism as public health crisis. And I think that in addition to that, it will provide some light on what it actually takes to make sure that those steps, those action steps, those call to actions items actually get implemented. And so I think that our push is to ensure that we build on the leadership momentum that exists, but also continue to see these efforts from the ground. And so with that, I just want to thank you so much for the time and attention this afternoon. I know I shared a lot. I hopefully gave you a lot of good food for thought. And I look forward to answering any questions you may have. There's Michael.
Hello. Thank you so much, Kweli. That was a lot of information in an hour, and I think folks are probably processing it all. I'm looking forward. I hope you share your slides with Kim so that we can send them out and digest that as time goes on, because there's a lot of work that you've done and Durham County certainly has done in this regard, and we can all benefit from that.
Absolutely.
Folks,
I'll make sure I make the slides available.
Excellent. Thank you. Please feel free to enter any questions you have in the chat box. Getting a lot of notes of thank you, of course, and appreciation. We have a question here. Is there a way for people who live in neighboring counties to get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we definitely welcome folks to attend and participate in the trainings that we offer. So we have another training, a groundwater presentation that we'll be offering through REI next Tuesday the 25th from 9 to 12. And I can send Kim the link so we can send that out to you guys, because you're welcome to attend. We can accommodate up to 100 people, and I don't think we hit that cap yet. And then in terms of, other jurisdictions, so in addition to GARE, there are other networks that are cropping up where municipalities, folks who work in county government or city government are looking to connect. And so we've done that. I've connected with folks across the state in some jurisdictions, and I think there's a way for us to kind of build on that momentum together and to ensure that you're engaged wherever you are. So I'd like to see more of that personally. And I think that, those avenues are ways to just deepen our networks and to ensure that we're connecting with folks to learn from one another. So, yeah.
Question here, is it the SAE as IDR training?
Say it again.
The question here, Carol, you may have to spell something. Is it the SAE as IDR training? Might need to spell that out for us.
Yeah, I don't think so. So the REI training is Racial Equity Institute, right? And that's a group out of Greensboro, based out of Greensboro, and they offer a groundwater presentation, which is a really in-depth data presentation about inequities across systems, right? So they are looking not just at history, but also the current practices that we see that really speak to the inequities in education and criminal legal and child welfare, and use this allegory of the groundwater to kind of make the point about how structural racism works. So that's the training that we'll be offering this time around, and we hope to continue that and into our next fiscal year, which starts July, and also to be able to do some of the phase 1 trainings. So that is a 2-day training, which goes into great depth about the history, the racial history in the United States, and to give us a sense of how the the wealth gap was created, and a good sense of how cities and counties were structured along the basis of race due to things like redlining, restrictive covenants. So there are some solid examples there of government's, complicitness and explicitness in perpetuating a lot of the racism that we're still grappling with today. So that is the phase 1 training. So we hope to be able to offer that as well.
I think a lot of folks are looking to connect with you. I don't know if you could share an email address if you'd be willing to in the chat.
Yeah, so let me
at the risk of maybe filling up your inbox.
No, and I can tell you, I created another email called racialequity@deconc.gov. I'm going to put it here in the chat. I don't know if I'm seeing what everybody else is seeing.
Are you on the event? Kweli, are you in the event tab or the stage tab? So
okay,
I think
go to the stage tab. Thank you.
Yeah, I made that mistake
Thank
earlier.
you.
That's how I know.
Okay, great. So I'll put it here.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. I wonder, Kweli, you talked a little bit about working across departments and how important that is. Do you have any lessons learned from doing it kind of across government? Us working outside of our departments is obviously important, but something that can be challenging. I'm wondering if you've seen lessons learned, opportunities there that would be relevant for the group, given that we're mainly public health departments.
Right. So I think that one of the lessons that I've learned is that you have to not make assumptions about people's starting point in terms of their understanding of racial equity, right? And so for many people of color, racial equity is personal because we've lived through the inequities themselves, right? And we have personal experiences with them that we can relate to. Whether it be ourselves directly or family members or stories that we've heard of our ancestors, generational stories that, just give us a sense of grounding who we are in our existence in this country and in our communities. So there's that. We just can't make an assumption about where people are starting from. And I think exploring those early experiences help to ground those conversations and give us a sense of where people are coming from. So we have generational differences. We have differences by race. We have differences by other identities as well, where people can think about where they might have experienced bias and oppression, for example. So allowing conversation and safe space for that kind of dialogue, I think, is a big lesson, and taking time to do so, because in as much as we want to debrief from current events and think about what is in front of us today, we also have to take the time to think about how we've been part of this history over time. And we are coming to this work with our own sort of lived experience and history over time as well. So I think that whole part about normalizing and just making sure that we take the time to educate people about definitions, common language, assumptions that we have, like why people are coming to the work. Some people feel like this is just the right thing to do, where we need to be. Others are like, well, I'm seeing this change happen within my respective department or institution, where more people of color are either being served here or staff change over time that is requiring me to think differently about how I serve diverse communities, for example. So whatever is bringing you to the work, we just need to have some outlet for digesting that and really understanding what that represents. Then the other thing that I'll say is oftentimes we do this as an add-on, right? So there's no real big incentive for folks to do racial equity work outside of their respective role, whatever that is. And so what is the incentive to keep people coming back, to keep the conversation, the commitment going? That has been another big lesson for me. And so I'm tapping into constantly, what are people thinking and feeling about the work? What would they like to see happen differently? And how might I help assist them in their respective roles and opportunities as well? So there's an exchange that's happening there, I think, that is important to kind of keep your finger on and just be mindful of. And the other thing that I'll say is that, we've got to constantly push and take that pulse check with leadership to make sure that this is something that stays on the radar, that we can direct attention to, so that we get the resources and supports that are needed to focus on the infrastructure development piece, because we don't want this to be a sort of one and done, or the flavor of the month, and then we no longer see or feel the traction in this area. So in order to keep it visible, we've got to make sure that our leadership is keeping it visible as well, and have what they need to be able to do so. So those are just some of my lessons learned over the past year, and things that I've reflected on, and things that I would just pass on to others who may find themselves in the same situation.
Excellent. Well, great way to wrap up this presentation. Thank you so much, Kweli. We have all benefited from your presentation and the hard work and amazing work that you all are doing there in Durham. So thank you for sharing it with us, and thank you, Rod, for bringing Kweli to us. We appreciate it. I know many of us will follow up with you after it. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
That was excellent.
Thank you. Okay,
all right,
you're welcome.
Yes, absolutely. And we have one more presentation left. We're going to go to break here at 2:15 and come back in 15 minutes at 2:30 with our final presentation of the day. So if the speakers could go ahead and get backstage, and we'll get things set up for our last presentation of the day. Thank you.